In a small, forgotten corner of Ireland, there exists a quiet mystery, one that has eluded the grasp of historians, doctors, and even the most curious minds. Imagine, if you will, a town in the early 19th century where, against all odds, no infants ever died. In a world ravaged by famine, disease, and brutal living conditions, this defies all logic. Infant mortality rates in rural Ireland during this time were among the highest in Europe. The constant threat of disease, poor nutrition, and a general lack of medical knowledge meant that children were more likely to die before they even learned to walk. Yet, in this particular village, nestled far from the bustling centers of power, something remarkable, and deeply unsettling, occurred. This small community seemed untouched by the suffering that plagued the rest of the nation. No infant deaths. Not a single one. It's almost impossible to fathom, isn't it? A place where the cruel reality of infant mortality, which claimed the lives of so many families across the world, simply didn't exist. At first glance, this may seem like a stroke of luck, a rare demographic quirk. But as the details unfold, this seemingly innocent anomaly begins to raise more questions than answers. Why was this town different? What was happening here that made this place so immune to the tragedies that struck neighboring villages? Was this really a miracle, or was there something darker, more sinister, lying beneath the surface? The year is 1826, and Ireland is a land in turmoil. The country is under British rule, its people living in the shadow of constant oppression. The Great Famine is yet to come, but its whispers are already felt in the air, in the fields where crops fail, and in the overcrowded, unsanitary homes where families live in close quarters. Ireland's rural areas, far removed from the influence of urban centres, were places where survival was never guaranteed. The threat of disease, from tuberculosis to cholera, hung like a spectre over every home, and yet this small village stood as an outlier in this grim landscape. The infant mortality rate in Ireland during the 19th century was staggeringly high. In fact, it was not unusual for 1 in 5 children to perish before reaching their first birthday. These numbers are hard to comprehend, but they paint a chilling picture of the hardships faced by Irish families during this period. In the absence of modern medicine, without vaccines, or the knowledge of sanitation we take for granted today, the survival of children was a daily gamble. Factors like poor nutrition, the prevalence of contagious diseases, and the harshness of rural life all contributed to the staggering loss of young lives. So, when a town emerges from such a backdrop with no recorded infant deaths, it stands out like a ghostly beacon in a dark and stormy sea. What could have caused this? Could it be that the people in this town simply had better access to nutrition, to clean water, or to a form of hygiene that was unknown in the rest of the country? Could the town have stumbled upon some secret formula for child rearing, a miraculous combination of diet, climate, and fortune? Or perhaps the answer is more complicated, even darker. Was this anomaly the result of a hidden truth, something the villagers kept to themselves, something no one dared to investigate? Could it be that this was not a story of hope and resilience, but of something far more insidious, a community united in silence, concealing the unthinkable? The mystery deepens when we consider the historical context. In 1826, Ireland was not the nation we think of today. The people were living in the grip of hardship, their lives shaped by centuries of British colonialism. Yet, even within this dark reality, there were pockets of resistance and survival. Some communities were resourceful, relying on traditions, folklore, and an instinct for self-preservation. Perhaps the people of this village had found some way to protect their infants from the harsh realities that claimed so many others. But this only raises more questions. Could something so simple, so easily overlooked, have allowed these children to survive when so many others perished? As we delve deeper into this case, we begin to wonder, was this town truly untouched by death, or was there something more at play here? The records, or lack thereof, tell us little. The town's population remains small, its boundaries clearly defined, yet the absence of death is so complete that it feels almost artificial. How could an entire town escape the plague of infant mortality? Was it the town's location, isolated in the hills and valleys of Ireland, cut off from the influences of the outside world? Was it the people, their customs, their way of life? Or was there something more insidious happening beneath the surface, something hidden from even the most watchful eye? As we begin our investigation into this strange and silent demographic mystery, we are forced to confront the uncomfortable possibility that the truth may never be fully revealed. In the 19th century, rural towns like this one were often overlooked by both the government and the medical establishment. Records were poorly kept, and many deaths, particularly those of infants, were never properly documented. Could the absence of infant deaths simply be the result of faulty or incomplete record keeping? Was this a case of the town's officials failing to report the deaths, or did they bury the truth for fear of scandal? Was there something they didn't want the outside world to know? The more we look at this mystery, the more we find ourselves caught in a web of speculation. What was this town hiding, if anything? Was there a secret to their survival that no one wanted to reveal, or had they simply been lucky in a world that offered little in the way of hope? As we continue to explore this strange case, the questions only multiply. And with each new twist, we come closer to understanding not just this village's secret, but the larger truths it may reveal about the human condition, about life, death, and the lengths we will go to in order to survive. In the year 1826, Ireland was a country bound by centuries of turmoil. Though the Great Famine had not yet struck, the seeds of disaster had already been sown, with a population struggling under the weight of economic stagnation, oppressive British rule, and a harsh, unforgiving landscape. The majority of the Irish population lived in rural areas, where life was often one of grinding poverty. These villages, isolated from the bustling centres of power, existed in a constant state of vulnerability. This was a time when famine, disease, and hardship were so ingrained in daily life that they seemed almost inevitable. Yet, in this period of despair, one small village would emerge with a mystery that defied all logic, a place where not a single infant death was recorded. The question that looms over this strange anomaly is why? How could this town, buried deep in the heart of a country so racked with suffering, stand apart from the rest of Ireland? How could it escape the relentless grip of death that claimed so many others? To understand this mystery, we must first delve into the context of 1826 Ireland, a land where infant mortality was rampant, where life expectancy for many was short, and where death was as much a part of the landscape as the hills and fields that stretched across the countryside. The statistics from this era are shocking, revealing a society where 1 in 5 children did not survive to see their first birthday. Infant mortality in rural Ireland was particularly high due to a complex combination of factors: malnutrition, disease, poor hygiene, and the absence of medical knowledge. The vast majority of rural communities had little to no access to trained doctors, and even the most basic forms of medical care, vaccinations, sterilization, antibiotics, were beyond their reach. Disease was a constant companion to these villages. Cholera, dysentery, tuberculosis, and smallpox ravaged entire communities, claiming the lives of young and old alike. Yet, in the midst of all this suffering, there was this one town that seemed untouched by the death that loomed so heavily over Ireland's children. Ireland's health infrastructure in the early 19th century was tragically underdeveloped. The medical establishment was primitive at best, and many rural areas had little to no access to formal health care. The concept of sanitation was still in its infancy, and people lived in overcrowded homes, often sharing space with livestock. Disease spread rapidly in these conditions, particularly among children, whose immune systems were ill-equipped to fight off the infections and illnesses that were common at the time. Poor nutrition, particularly in the form of a diet reliant on potatoes, contributed to weakened immune systems and made the population more susceptible to disease. These conditions were exacerbated by the absence of modern public health measures. Vaccines, which today help protect infants from diseases like measles, polio, and whooping cough, were not yet invented. In short, the 19th century Irish countryside was a dangerous place to be a child. So, how could a town in the heart of this diseased, impoverished, and medically ignorant landscape not experience a single infant death in 1826? Was it luck, or was there something more? Some have speculated that this village may have simply had better living conditions than its neighbouring towns, cleaner water, more nutritious food, or a less contaminated environment. After all, Ireland's rural areas were often quite isolated. Some villages were nestled in valleys or on hills, where they might be shielded from the worst of the diseases that spread across more populous areas. Could the town have benefited from a combination of geography and isolation, allowing its residents to avoid the deadly epidemics that swept through the surrounding regions? Perhaps the town had avoided the worst of the famine and disease outbreaks that plagued other parts of the country during this period. But was this isolation enough to explain the complete absence of infant mortality? While isolation and better access to resources might have helped, they do not fully account for the extraordinary nature of this village's demographic record. After all, many other rural villages, equally isolated and poor, experienced the same brutal conditions yet could not escape the high rates of infant death. Was there something about this particular town's way of life, something in the very fabric of the community that allowed it to thrive when others faltered? At the time, Irish villages were often tied to their religious and cultural beliefs, with the Catholic faith playing a central role in shaping the lives of the people. Catholicism was more than just a religious practice. It was woven into every aspect of life, from birth to death, from marriage to daily routines. Could the town's survival be linked to its faith? Ireland's rural communities often relied on local saints and religious rituals to protect them from the unknown forces of disease and death. It's possible that the residents of this town believed they were being shielded by divine protection or by the intercession of a patron saint. The Irish people had a deep connection to their religious beliefs, and in times of suffering, many turned to faith as a source of solace and strength. The town's isolation might have fostered a sense of spiritual unity, and this could have led the villagers to believe that their community was under divine protection. Perhaps they performed rituals, offered prayers, or participated in religious practices that they believed could safeguard their children from the harsh realities of the world. The power of belief should never be underestimated, especially in a time and place where science and medicine were in their infancy. It's possible that the people of this town viewed the survival of their infants as a miracle, a sign of divine favor or protection. Could this belief have acted as a psychological shield, providing them with the resilience to face the challenges of life? Were the villagers' beliefs strong enough to transcend the very real physical dangers that surrounded them? In this way, faith could have been both a literal and figurative barrier, insulating them from the harsh conditions that led to infant death in other parts of Ireland. However, as we probe deeper into this mystery, we must consider other, less optimistic possibilities. Could it be that the records of infant mortality were simply not being kept accurately? After all, in rural villages with few external checks and no formal oversight, the possibility of missed or manipulated records is a real concern. Was this absence of infant deaths the result of negligence or even deliberate falsification? Could the town's leaders or religious figures have hidden the truth of infant deaths for reasons that remain unclear? The village's demographic anomaly may have been so striking that it became a source of pride, a point of pride that led to the selective recording of data, or worse, the intentional withholding of unpleasant facts. Perhaps the deaths were simply unrecorded, buried in the private lives of families too ashamed to report the truth, or too fearful of what others might think. The absence of recorded deaths also raises questions about the reliability of the town's historical records. Were these records even accurate? In an age before computers and meticulous documentation, it's easy to imagine how data could be lost, ignored, or altered. In the absence of modern census-taking and medical documentation, it is possible that the absence of infant deaths in this village was an error of omission, a statistical anomaly born from inadequate record-keeping rather than some miraculous protection. Still, despite all these potential explanations, there is something eerily compelling about this town's story. It is difficult to dismiss the possibility that there was something extraordinary at play here. Could there have been an environmental factor, something in the soil, water, or climate, that offered a natural form of protection? Maybe the town's location, isolated in a valley or nestled in a remote part of Ireland, kept it free from the contagions that spread through more populated areas. This geographical isolation might have played a key role in keeping disease at bay, shielding the infants of this town from the deadly epidemics that ravaged nearby villages. But again, this theory begs the question: why didn't other, similarly isolated villages also escape the brutal fate of infant mortality? As we explore this enigma, we must accept that the answer may never be fully uncovered. What we know is that this village exists in history as an anomaly, a place where infants thrived in a time and place where others perished. The factors behind this strange and unsettling phenomenon are still elusive, hidden within the layers of history, folklore, and speculation. What is certain is that this story, this dark demographic mystery, is one that will continue to haunt us, challenging our understanding of survival, fate, and the forces that shape human life. The town at the center of this strange mystery was no grand metropolis, no thriving industrial hub, but a small, isolated community, tucked away from the bustling cities and crowded towns that defined Ireland in the early 19th century. It was the type of place where everyone knew everyone, and the rhythm of life was governed by the changing of the seasons, the ebb and flow of crops, and the religious calendar. Its inhabitants were a hardy, self-sufficient people, living lives marked by simplicity, struggle, and an intimate connection to the land. The town's isolation could be considered both a blessing and a curse. It allowed its residents to maintain their traditional ways of life, far removed from the rapid changes of the outside world. Yet it also meant they were more vulnerable to the harsh realities of life in rural Ireland during this time. disease, famine, and the looming shadow of British colonial rule. Though it was small, the town had a strong sense of community. People supported each other, sharing what little they had and working together to ensure the survival of the village. Their lives were shaped by the rhythms of the land, sowing in spring, harvesting in fall, and praying for enough rain to sustain the crops through the summer. In many ways, the town's way of life mirrored the timeless cycles of nature, unhurried, steadfast, and determined. The residents understood the fragility of life, and yet, in the face of relentless adversity, they had somehow managed to survive. But even in this close-knit community, there were no guarantees. Death, as it did in every community, hovered on the periphery of their lives, waiting for the slightest opening to slip in. It could come in the form of disease, famine, or the accidents that inevitably occurred when life was lived so close to the edge. In this setting, where death was a frequent companion, the fact that not a single infant death was recorded in 1826 became a subject of intense curiosity. What made this particular village so different? Was there some secret at play, something that allowed its children to survive when so many others perished? In a time when a single bout of diarrhea, a common cold, or a mild fever could easily turn fatal for an infant, how was it possible that none of the children in this town seemed to fall victim to the same grim fate? To understand this, we must first examine the people who lived in the town, the families whose children defied the odds. The families were not wealthy by any means. They lived in modest homes, many of them little more than small cottages built from stone and thatch, with dirt floors and a single hearth to heat the entire dwelling. The homes were simple, functional, and often overcrowded. Families would huddle together around the fire, sharing meals of bread, potatoes, and the occasional bit of salted pork or fish. Though the diet was far from ideal, it was enough to sustain them, at least for the time being. The homes were often shared with livestock, goats, sheep, and chickens, which were a crucial source of food and income. The animals also provided milk, eggs, and wool, all of which contributed to the daily life of the villagers. The close quarters and shared living spaces, however, meant that disease could spread quickly, particularly among children whose immune systems were still developing. The villagers were hardy people, used to the harsh realities of rural life. They work the land, tending to their crops and animals, and they work hard to preserve the traditional ways of life that had been passed down from generation to generation. Yet despite their strength, the village was not immune to the external forces that were at play in Ireland at the time. The British-imposed system of land ownership had left many of the villagers in poverty, unable to secure even the most basic needs, while the country as a whole struggled under the weight of colonial rule. The Irish were a people at the mercy of forces beyond their control, and yet in this small town, they had somehow managed to shield their children from the worst of these hardships. Could it have been that the families in this village were simply more careful, more mindful of the health of their children than others in neighboring areas? Did they have some secret, passed down from parent to child, that helped to ensure the survival of their infants? Perhaps they were more attuned to the subtle signs of illness, able to recognize when a child was ill and take swift action to prevent the spread of disease. In a time when medical knowledge was rudimentary at best, it was the knowledge passed down through families, the remedies, the herbal treatments, the prayers, and the superstitions, that often made the difference between life and death. Could the town's residents have had a greater understanding of what kept their children healthy, even if they couldn't explain it in terms of modern medicine? It's possible that their relative isolation played a role in their success. The town was situated in a remote area, far removed from the large cities and the dense populations that often served as breeding grounds for disease. Could it have been that the town's geographical location allowed it to avoid the outbreaks of cholera, tuberculosis, and other deadly diseases that had claimed the lives of so many infants in neighboring regions? The surrounding countryside, with its streams, hills, and forests, may have provided a natural barrier to the spread of infection. Without the constant influx of travelers and outsiders, the village may have been better able to maintain its protective cocoon of isolation. Yet even with these factors in mind, the question remains, why this town? Why did the infant mortality rate here seem to differ so drastically from the rest of the country? The geographic isolation of the village might have played a role, but it doesn't entirely explain the absence of infant deaths. There were other villages in similar circumstances, far removed from the larger urban centers, yet they still experienced high levels of infant mortality. Was there something about this particular village, something in the very fabric of its community, that allowed it to shield its children from death's grip? Was it the collective strength of the people, their resilience, and their determination to protect their children from harm? Or was it something more, something hidden, perhaps even darker, that no one was willing to confront? As the mystery of this town unfolds, we also have to consider the possibility that the people of this community were hiding something. In a time when medical knowledge was so limited, it's possible that the town's inhabitants kept certain practices hidden from outsiders. Was there a secret to their survival that no one was willing to share, something they believed was key to protecting their children? It's not hard to imagine a community that, in its desperation to survive, might resort to practices that were considered taboo or even illegal. Perhaps there were those among them who believed that certain rituals, certain protections, might shield their infants from the harsh realities of life. It's possible that the villagers knew something about the fragility of life, something they kept hidden from the rest of the world. But even if these practices were benign, simple precautions or old folk remedies that were passed down through generations, the fact remains that something about this town, its way of life, and the people who inhabited it was fundamentally different from the rest of Ireland. The question lingers: what was it? Was it a miracle, a stroke of good fortune? Or was it something far more unsettling? A secret buried deep within the community's past, waiting to be uncovered? This town's mystery is not one that can be easily explained. It doesn't fit neatly into the conventional understanding of history or health. But in its strangeness, it offers us a glimpse into a world long gone, a world where survival was never guaranteed, and where people did whatever they could to protect their children from the ravages of disease and death. The town's story challenges everything we think we know about the past, about life and death, and about the lengths people will go to in order to survive. As we continue to dig deeper into this mystery, we are forced to ask ourselves, how much do we really know about the past, about the lives of those who came before us, and about the secrets they left behind? The investigation into the town's strange and silent demographic mystery begins with a troubling realization. The records, or lack thereof, offer little clarity. At first glance, the absence of infant deaths in 1826 might seem like a statistical anomaly, a rare, unexplained event that happened to take place in this small, isolated community. But as we begin to dig deeper into the historical records, a troubling truth emerges. We are faced with a complete lack of documentation on this subject. It's as though this village, tucked away in the hills of Ireland, existed in a parallel world where death didn't touch the young, and where the deaths that did occur, if any, were never recorded. The more we look, the more the mystery grows. In the 19th century, Ireland, like much of the world, was a place where record-keeping was rudimentary at best. Few institutions were able to document the daily lives of the rural population. Local parish records often contained incomplete information or were poorly maintained. The lack of formal birth certificates, standardized death registers, and modern census-taking methods made it difficult to track vital statistics in any consistent or reliable way. So, the question arises, could this apparent absence of infant mortality be nothing more than an error of record-keeping? Could the village simply have failed to document the deaths of infants, either out of negligence, ignorance, or, more disturbingly, a desire to hide the truth? To begin with, it's essential to understand the state of record-keeping during this time. While urban centers had more developed systems for tracking births, deaths, and marriages, the rural areas of Ireland were often left to their own devices. Many villages, especially those isolated from the influence of larger cities, had little to no interaction with the state or its official structures. Parish priests were often the only ones responsible for maintaining records, and their work was far from systematic. Without the aid of centralized databases, records were often kept on paper in simple ledgers, which could easily be lost, damaged, or destroyed. In the case of a small, remote village like this one, it's possible that deaths, especially those of infants, were never properly recorded. In fact, some villages may have simply failed to keep track of such deaths altogether, either because they were deemed insignificant or because the community members were more focused on survival than on documenting the harsh realities of their lives. But the question of whether this was merely a failure of documentation is not so easily dismissed. After all, an entire year had passed without a single recorded infant death. How could this be the result of an administrative oversight or clerical error? It seems unlikely that an entire community, one that faced the same diseases, the same risks, and the same hardships as others, would be completely exempt from infant mortality, and yet, the records suggest that it was. Perhaps the solution lies not in neglect but in deliberate manipulation, an attempt to present the town in a better light, or perhaps even to create a narrative of miraculous survival. In the absence of solid evidence, we must also turn to the possibility of cultural factors influencing the way the records were kept. In 1826, Ireland was still very much under British rule, and much of the population lived in a state of economic and social subjugation. The Irish were often treated as second-class citizens, and the rural poor were especially vulnerable to the neglect of both the state and the upper classes. In such a context, it is possible that there was a desire to present the community in a favorable light, to demonstrate that they were somehow different, better, stronger, or more resilient than the surrounding villages. The records, then, may have been deliberately altered or embellished to showcase the town's apparent success in avoiding the ravages of infant death. One could speculate that the local priests or officials, feeling the pressure of their socio-political circumstances, might have taken it upon themselves to skew the statistics, either to protect their community's reputation or to present an idealized version of village life to the outside world. The town's leaders might have understood the importance of presenting an image of health and prosperity, especially in an era when Ireland's rural population was often associated with poverty, disease, and ignorance. The absence of infant deaths could have been framed as a triumph, a testament to the village's self-sufficiency, faith, or even divine protection. Perhaps the priests, who held great influence in these communities, saw this as an opportunity to solidify their position or to bolster the morale of their fellow villagers, convincing them that their way of life was not only sustainable but exemplary. But if the records were intentionally manipulated or selectively curated, the question then becomes, why were they manipulated? What did the village have to gain from presenting a narrative of perfect health? Could it be that the community was trying to distance itself from the broader struggles of Ireland, to assert its own identity in the face of hardship? Or was there a deeper, more sinister motive at play, one that was tied to secrecy or shame? There is also the possibility that the lack of recorded deaths in this town might not have been the result of deliberate manipulation at all but simply a reflection of the town's lack of external oversight. Many villages in 19th century Ireland were isolated not just geographically but politically. Without the presence of officials from the state or the medical establishment, there was little incentive or requirement to document events such as infant deaths. It is conceivable that the local population, accustomed to a life of isolation, simply did not see the need to record such events, particularly if they were not viewed as extraordinary. In rural communities, death, even the death of an infant, was not always treated with the same gravity as it might be in more urban settings, where record-keeping and the bureaucracy surrounding death were more formalized. In these isolated villages, it's possible that the death of a child, although tragic, was seen as a part of life, something to be mourned privately but not necessarily something that required public acknowledgement or formal documentation. Another avenue of exploration in understanding the lack of recorded deaths is the social and economic pressures that existed in the town. The people of this village were likely living on the margins of survival. In an age before modern healthcare, families were forced to rely on their own knowledge and resources to keep their children alive. Perhaps the town had developed its own customs and methods for preventing infant deaths, whether through herbal remedies, special diets, or protective rituals passed down through generations. These practices, if they existed, might have been so deeply embedded in the fabric of the community that they were considered private matters, not something to be recorded in official registers. The fear of outsiders discovering their secrets, or the belief that their practices were too sacred or too strange to be shared, could have led the villagers to avoid formal documentation of their children's survival. But even with all these theories, the most pressing question remains: how could an entire town go an entire year without a single recorded death? Was it really a miracle, as some have suggested, or was there something more at play here, something hidden beneath the surface, obscured by time, distance, and the lack of solid evidence? Perhaps the truth lies in the intersection of historical, cultural, and social forces that shape this village in ways we cannot fully comprehend. Perhaps the mystery of the town's perfect record of infant survival will never be fully unraveled, lost to the passage of time and the inevitable decay of historical records. But in searching for the answer, we are forced to confront uncomfortable truths about the fragility of life, the nature of death, and the lengths to which communities will go to protect their own. The records, so incomplete and unreliable, may never tell the full story, but they open a door, if only a crack, into a world that we can never truly know. As we continue to unravel the mystery of this small Irish town, another layer of complexity emerges when we start to examine the community's own beliefs, traditions, and practices. In a time and place where survival was never guaranteed, where death seemed a constant companion, it is entirely possible that the people of this village had developed a series of customs, rituals, or belief systems that allowed them to protect their children from the harsh realities of life. These practices may have been rooted in deep cultural traditions, passed down from generation to generation, or they may have emerged out of sheer necessity in the face of relentless hardship. Either way, the possibility that the community's collective knowledge and faith played a crucial role in preventing infant deaths cannot be overlooked. In the early 19th century, Ireland was a deeply religious country, and Catholicism was not merely a belief system, it was a way of life. It shaped the moral framework of society, the structure of communities, and even the everyday routines of individuals. The Irish people, particularly in rural areas, had a strong sense of spirituality that was closely tied to their survival. In times of great suffering, faith often became the one thing that could offer solace, hope, and protection. For many, religious rituals, prayers, and invocations were seen as ways to ward off misfortune and protect loved ones from the forces of disease, famine, and death. The town's religious practices could very well have played a key role in ensuring the survival of its infants. It's likely that the villagers saw their children not just as individuals, but as sacred beings whose lives were intimately tied to the divine. This belief may have influenced their behavior and the way they raised their children. The villagers could have taken extra precautions, rooted in their faith, to safeguard their infants from harm. Religious ceremonies, prayers for protection, and rituals invoking the saints could have been deeply ingrained in their daily lives. The local priest, a central figure in the community, may have provided guidance and spiritual protection to families, offering blessings, holy water, or other forms of sacramental aid to shield infants from disease or death. This type of spiritual intervention was common in rural Ireland, where people often relied on their faith to face the unknown dangers of the world. In addition to their religious practices, the people of the town may have adhered to certain folk traditions and superstitions that helped to ensure the survival of their children. These practices would have been deeply tied to Irish folklore, a rich tapestry of myths, legends, and beliefs passed down through generations. Folk remedies and customs, often based on centuries-old wisdom, were commonly used to treat illnesses and protect against harm. It's possible that the villagers had developed their own set of healing practices, passed down from elders, which they believed could keep their children safe from the dangers of disease. These could have included herbal remedies, protective charms, or rituals meant to ward off evil spirits and malevolent forces that were thought to cause harm to infants. The use of herbs and plants for medicinal purposes was widespread in 19th century Ireland, particularly in rural areas where access to formal healthcare was limited. Certain herbs and plants, like nettles, elderflower, and garlic, were believed to have protective properties, and mothers would have used them to make teas, poultices, or ointments to protect their children from illness. The villagers may have also had specific dietary practices designed to boost the health of their infants. For example, breastfeeding was considered essential for a child's survival, and mothers may have used local food sources to provide the necessary nutrients to strengthen their infants' immune systems. This reliance on nature's bounty, coupled with the belief that certain foods and herbs could provide spiritual protection, may have contributed to the unusual survival rate of the town's children. Another significant factor in the town's apparent immunity to infant mortality could have been the way in which the community's social structure operated. In rural Ireland, families often lived in close quarters, with multiple generations sharing the same household. This close-knit structure would have fostered a sense of collective responsibility for the well-being of the children. In such a community, it's possible that every member of the household, from the oldest grandparent to the youngest child, played a role in the care and protection of infants. The sense of intergenerational support and care would have been vital in ensuring that children received the attention and care they needed to survive. The older generations, who had lived through their own hardships, would have had valuable knowledge and experience to offer, including wisdom about infant care, disease prevention, and healing practices. It's likely that the village operated as a collective, with everyone working together to protect the most vulnerable members of the community. The town's social structure may have also played a role in its ability to avoid the devastating effects of famine and disease. The Irish rural population was known for its resilience in the face of hardship, and in times of crisis, communities often banded together to support each other. In a small, isolated village like this one, it is conceivable that the residents had developed a strong sense of solidarity and mutual aid. They would have shared resources, supported one another through illness and hardship, and worked together to ensure the survival of the entire community. This social cohesion could have acted as a form of protection, ensuring that infants received the care and attention they needed to thrive. If one child fell ill, the entire community might have rallied around them, providing comfort, medical assistance, and even spiritual support to prevent the spread of disease and protect other infants from falling ill. At the same time, the town's geographical isolation could have played a protective role as well. In an era before widespread transportation and communication, Rural communities like this one were often cut off from the rest of the world. While this isolation meant that the town was shielded from the influence of larger cities and urban centers, it also meant that the villages were somewhat insulated from the disease outbreaks and epidemics that ravaged the more densely populated regions. Without a constant influx of travelers and outsiders, the village would have been less likely to be exposed to new pathogens or diseases. It's possible that the community's isolation allowed it to remain largely untouched by the contagions that claimed the lives of so many other infants. The residents would have lived in a protective bubble, free from the diseases that were rampant in the larger towns and cities. The town's remote location, coupled with its reliance on self-sufficiency and collective care, may have created the ideal conditions for infants to survive. Despite these plausible explanations, we must also entertain the unsettling possibility that the community was hiding something darker. In a time when infant mortality was so common, it is conceivable that the people of this town were aware of the delicate balance between life and death. They may have been so protective of their children, so desperate to shield them from harm, that they went to great lengths to conceal the reality of infant deaths from outsiders. Perhaps the villagers, fearing that the death of an infant would bring shame upon the community, deliberately kept quiet about any deaths that did occur. They may have gone so far as to bury these deaths in secrecy, ensuring that no one outside the village ever learned of them. This could have been done to preserve the town's reputation, to protect the villagers from the stigma associated with infant mortality, or to maintain the illusion of perfection. In any case, the idea that the people of this town relied on their beliefs, their traditions, and their collective sense of responsibility to protect their infants from harm is an idea that cannot be easily dismissed. Whether it was through their religious faith, their folk traditions, or their social cohesion, the town's inhabitants may have unknowingly or consciously created a set of practices and customs that allowed their children to survive in an environment where others would have perished. It is impossible to say for certain what the true reason was for this anomaly, but one thing is clear: the people of this village, through a combination of belief, tradition, and community, were able to defy the odds. Whether through faith, isolation, or sheer will, they managed to keep their children alive, in a time when so many others were lost to the ravages of disease, famine, and neglect. The mystery of this town remains unsolved, but its story offers a fascinating glimpse into the resilience of human beings, and the lengths they will go to in order to protect the ones they love. As we delve deeper into the mystery of the town, the question that continues to linger is why this isolated community, with all its unique characteristics, seemed to defy the statistical odds when it came to infant mortality. Was it simply the result of an environmental quirk, or was there something more at play here, something that we are still unable to fully grasp? In the absence of concrete records, we are left to examine the broader implications of this anomaly, considering both the scientific and social factors that might have influenced the outcomes in this community. We must begin to look beyond mere coincidence and consider the possibility that the town's history, its geography, and even its role in a larger socio-political context all contributed to its exceptional situation. One of the first areas of exploration is the environmental factors that may have played a crucial role in the survival of infants in this particular town. Ireland, in the early 19th century, was a country marked by extremes in both landscape and weather. The rolling hills, the thick forests, the rivers, and the coastal areas all combined to create a complex set of ecological conditions. In some parts of Ireland, fertile soil and ample rainfall allowed for successful farming, while in others, harsh winters and poor soil made life a struggle. It's entirely possible that this particular village was located in a unique microclimate, an area sheltered from the harsher environmental forces that might have caused other villages to suffer more extreme disease outbreaks, malnutrition, or crop failure. Geography played a significant role in shaping the health outcomes of rural communities in the 19th century. Towns situated in valleys or isolated from major roads and transportation routes might have had less contact with the disease outbreaks that regularly affected more populated areas. The remote location of this village could have provided it with a natural shield against the infectious diseases that traveled along trade routes and through busy marketplaces. Without regular visitors, travelers, or even traders from the outside world, the risk of new pathogens entering the community would have been significantly reduced. In this way, the geographical isolation of the village might have acted as a protective barrier, allowing the community to avoid some of the disease outbreaks that were rampant in other parts of Ireland. Such isolation would have made the spread of illnesses like cholera, tuberculosis, and typhoid fever much less likely. Yet, the lack of exposure to outside diseases could not have been the sole reason behind the village's extraordinary record. There must have been additional factors that helped the infants in this community survive, factors that went beyond just geography. One crucial element that stands out when we consider this small town is the possibility of a diet and lifestyle that supported healthier infants and children. While malnutrition was widespread in many parts of Ireland, particularly in rural areas that relied heavily on the potato as a staple crop, the people in this town may have had access to a more varied diet, one that provided them with essential nutrients. It's worth noting that certain areas of Ireland were better suited for the cultivation of diverse crops, and some villages had more access to fresh meat, dairy, and fish, which would have contributed to a more balanced diet for both children and adults. Nutritional health was a major factor in infant survival during the 19th century, and the people of this town could have benefited from a diet that was rich in vitamins and minerals. For example, dairy products such as milk and butter, along with eggs, could have provided the essential fats and proteins necessary for healthy development. Additionally, certain herbs, fruits, and vegetables, which could have been grown locally, would have helped to bolster the immune system of both adults and children. Without access to proper nutrition, children were more vulnerable to disease and infection, and the absence of a balanced diet could have been a significant contributing factor to the high rates of infant mortality seen in many other rural communities. But in this particular town, where the residents were likely living off the land and practicing self-sufficiency, their access to a more nutritious food supply may have been an important advantage. However, to focus solely on geography and diet would be to miss the more subtle, yet no less important, social factors that might have contributed to the exceptional health of the town's infants. In rural communities, particularly in Ireland during this period, families often lived in close-knit, multi-generational households. These households were composed not only of parents and children but also of extended family members, such as grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins. The concept of extended family living under one roof was not just a practical arrangement but a cultural one, rooted in centuries of tradition. The role of extended family in child-rearing cannot be overstated, as it allowed for greater support systems and more hands to care for a newborn or sick child. In such an environment, where several generations of family members interacted daily, the health and well-being of the youngest members of the community would have been prioritized by a larger group of caregivers. Infants and young children would have had the attention not just of their parents but also of their grandparents and other relatives. This intergenerational structure may have been key to the survival of the infants in the town, as older generations often possessed valuable knowledge about infant care, disease prevention, and the proper treatment of illness. Grandparents, who had lived through their own hardships and child-rearing experiences, could have provided invaluable advice and assistance, teaching younger parents the tried-and-true methods for keeping their children healthy. Beyond just the family structure, the town's overall social cohesion likely played a significant role in infant survival. In rural Irish communities, people were often deeply connected by shared history, common values, and a strong sense of mutual responsibility. The bonds between neighbors were tight, and the culture of support, both emotional and practical, was integral to the survival of the community as a whole. The people of the town likely looked out for one another, particularly the most vulnerable members of the community, the elderly, the sick, and, of course, the children. This sense of solidarity may have been especially important in times of crisis, when the threat of famine, disease, or other external forces loomed large. The community's willingness to come together in support of families and children would have created an environment where infants were less likely to be neglected or left without care, even during difficult times. The role of the town's religious practices in this sense of community cohesion cannot be overlooked either. Religion, in rural Ireland, was often the glue that held communities together, providing not just spiritual guidance but also social structure and cohesion. Religious festivals, communal prayers, and church gatherings were central to village life, and these occasions often provided opportunities for the community to come together and support one another. In a town where faith was central to daily life, it is possible that religious teachings and practices acted as a kind of protective force, reinforcing the community's commitment to caring for its most vulnerable members. The local priest, who was likely the most important spiritual and social figure in the town, would have played an influential role in shaping the town's approach to infant care and health. It is conceivable that the priest would have not only provided spiritual guidance and administered sacraments, but also acted as a point of contact for health matters. Given the absence of formal medical care in many rural areas, priests often found themselves in the role of caregivers, offering comfort and counsel to those who were ill and tending to the sick. The priest could have also been a source of comfort for grieving families, providing them with the support they needed in times of loss. This strong sense of communal care and religious unity could have created a protective shield around the children of the town. In an era where infant mortality was high, The act of raising a child was not just a personal endeavor but a communal one. Everyone in the town, from the elders to the young, would have felt a sense of responsibility for ensuring the survival and well-being of the infants. This shared commitment to the survival of the young could have provided a form of social insurance that protected children from the diseases, neglect, and malnutrition that claimed so many lives in other communities. While there were certainly external factors that may have contributed to the town's low infant mortality rate, such as its geographical isolation, diet, and close-knit social structure, it's also important to recognize that the town's internal social dynamics played a major role in creating an environment where infants were more likely to survive. The strength of the community, bolstered by its religious beliefs and shared sense of responsibility, formed the bedrock upon which the survival of its youngest members rested. The people of this town, bound together by faith, tradition, and mutual support, created a safety net for their children, ensuring that the forces of disease and misfortune had less of a chance to take hold. In the end, the mystery of why this town defied the odds of infant mortality may never be fully solved. But by examining the broader context, the community's religious practices, its social structure, and its connection to the land, we begin to see a picture of resilience, cooperation, and faith that allowed these children to survive in a world where others perished. The town story is not just one of survival against the odds, but one that speaks to the power of human connection, the importance of community, and the lengths people will go to in order to protect the ones they love. In the end, perhaps the most enduring legacy of this town is not the mystery of its perfect record, but the lesson it teaches us about the strength of the human spirit in the face of adversity. As we dig deeper into the mystery of this town, we are confronted with the stark realization that the records we are working with, or the absence of them, may only tell part of the story. We find ourselves grappling with a pervasive sense of ambiguity, where every attempt to explain the phenomenon of zero recorded infant deaths raises new questions. The very lack of information, the absence of comprehensive records, the absence of concrete data, forces us to confront the murky waters of history itself. It's as if this town's story, instead of being neatly written down in the annals of time, has been deliberately obscured by some unknown force, locked away in the fragile memories of those who lived it. This silence leaves us pondering the limits of historical documentation and the nuances of how human lives were recorded and remembered. Yet, beyond the lack of clear records, we cannot ignore the larger context of Ireland during the early 19th century. The country was in the midst of a struggle for its own identity, caught between colonial rule and the desire for autonomy. The Irish population was suffering under British control, facing widespread poverty, food shortages, and oppressive policies. In this environment, the very act of survival was political, a form of quiet resistance to the forces that sought to control and diminish their lives. For many, simply existing was an act of defiance. In this context, it's possible that the town's exceptional record of infant survival was not just a matter of local health practices or good fortune, but something more deeply intertwined with the political and social fabric of Ireland at the time. The experience of the Irish people during this period was marked by a profound tension. On the one hand, there was the immense suffering caused by British policies, including the harsh penal laws and the disruption of traditional Irish life. On the other hand, there was the resilience of the Irish people, their ability to adapt and fight back against the forces of oppression. This dynamic was evident in every aspect of life, from the church to the fields, from the kitchen to the burial grounds. In many ways, the Irish people were living in a state of survival, not just in terms of physical endurance, but emotionally and psychologically, too. This form of endurance is not easy to comprehend from a distance, and it's easy to see why many of the records of the time fail to capture the emotional landscape of communities that had endured so much. The lack of infant deaths in this particular town may, in fact, be a reflection of this survival instinct, this will to live. It may have been more than just a series of isolated incidents or good practices. It could have been a collective act of cultural and emotional defiance, a refusal to let death claim the children of this community when so much else had been taken from them. The fact that this small group managed to keep their children alive, even in the face of widespread infant mortality in surrounding areas, might suggest an underlying will to protect the future at all costs. It could indicate that the survival of the next generation was seen not only as a personal goal but as a collective one that tied the community together in ways that may have been beyond the conscious understanding of its members. The community's emotional landscape also likely played a key role in shaping its approach to survival. Rural communities like this one, especially in Ireland during this time, were characterized by deep emotional connections between people. These emotional bonds weren't simply the result of familial ties but were cultivated through shared experiences of hardship and collective effort. It's possible that the people of this town were so emotionally and psychologically intertwined with the fate of their children that they were, in a sense, subconsciously invested in their survival. The survival of an infant was not just a biological or physical matter, it was a deeply emotional one, woven into the fabric of the community's existence. If the village had built its very identity around the preservation of life, then each child's survival would have been seen as a victory for the community as a whole. In a time when disease and death were omnipresent, keeping the children alive was not just a private concern, it was a shared, communal priority. We also cannot ignore the broader historical context of medical knowledge, or the lack thereof, during this period. In the early 19th century, Ireland was still under British rule, and the island's rural areas were largely neglected by the medical establishment. Hospitals were few and far between, and most people had limited access to trained physicians. The understanding of diseases, particularly those affecting infants, was rudimentary at best. Without modern medicine or an understanding of germ theory, communities were left to rely on traditional remedies, folk medicine, and their own observations about what worked and what didn't. In this environment, survival was often a matter of trial and error, of learning from experience rather than science. But there is another possibility worth considering. Could the villagers have developed an intuitive understanding of what their children needed to survive, based not just on trial and error but on some sort of ancestral or collective wisdom? It's entirely possible that the people of the town had accumulated knowledge over generations about infant care, child-rearing, and disease prevention, knowledge that was passed down in ways we cannot fully grasp today. They might have had an intuitive sense of what worked, even if they didn't fully understand why. In the absence of modern medical practices, it is possible that the people of this town had cultivated a deep understanding of the physical and emotional needs of their children, a form of knowledge that was passed down through generations and shared within the community. This knowledge would have been more than just practical information. It would have been intertwined with the culture and values of the community. In many ways, the health of the children would have been seen as a reflection of the community itself. The survival of the next generation was not just a personal victory, but a communal one, a sign of the collective strength and endurance of the people. The children were not just the future of individual families, they were the future of the town, and the preservation of life was a goal that united everyone, regardless of age or status. However, the question remains, why is there such a profound silence surrounding the true story of this town? Why, in an age when so much was written down and recorded, is there such a lack of documentation about this extraordinary phenomenon? It could be that the town, in its desire to protect its own, simply chose to keep the reality of its situation hidden from the outside world. It could be that the villagers felt that to reveal too much would risk inviting scrutiny or criticism from those who might not understand their ways. Or perhaps they believed that their methods, their beliefs, and their practices were too sacred or too personal to be shared with outsiders. In a time when privacy was fiercely guarded, particularly in small rural communities, it's possible that the town's secrets were simply never meant to be uncovered. Yet, the silence surrounding the records of infant survival also raises a larger question about the historical record itself. How often are stories like this one lost to time, obscured by the limitations of what we choose to document and remember? How many other towns, villages, or communities, hidden in the annals of history, have similar stories, tales of survival against the odds, of triumphs that never made it into the official record? The absence of documentation doesn't mean the story didn't happen. It means that the story was never fully understood or appreciated by those who were responsible for recording history. The mystery of this town, and the silence that surrounds it, serves as a poignant reminder of the gaps in our understanding of the past and the ways in which human lives, experiences, and stories can slip through the cracks of history. Perhaps the story of this town's survival is not just a story about the defiance of infant mortality, but a story about the limitations of our own historical perspective. It forces us to confront the idea that, for all the records we keep and the knowledge we accumulate, we can never fully capture the complexity of human experience. The silence surrounding this town's history leaves us with more questions than answers, and it compels us to reflect on the stories we have lost, the stories we have chosen not to hear, and the stories that will never be told. In the end, the absence of records, the gaps in our understanding, may be the most significant part of this story, offering us a deeper insight into the complexities of survival, memory, and history itself.